Let's start off with 2015, and I think this is a good place to start because there were so many trades at this deadline, one of the most active deadlines that I can remember, and the Royals, who were coming off a World Series loss against the Giants the year prior, made a couple of key moves, one being Ben Zobrist. He had so many good years with the Rays, 2009, one of the most underrated seasons in my opinion. He went to Oakland that year, but then they moved him to Kansas City. He ended up being really solid for them down the stretch, hit 284 with an OPS of 816. He was playing all over the field. We knew how Ben Zobrist was back then. Ended up being a really solid piece for the Royals en route to their championship, but it wasn't just Ben Zobrist. It was also Johnny Cueto. Now, at the time, the Royals, they had a couple of pitchers in their rotation. You had Yordany Ventura. You had Edinson Volquez. They needed one more piece there, and Johnny Cueto was in the middle of a really good season with the Reds that year. With the Royals, he ended up not pitching all that great, right? He was 4-7, had an ERA of 4.76, FIP at a 4.06, but the postseason was where it mattered for Johnny Cueto. He came up big for them. He was really clutch in that postseason. But it wasn't just the Royals, it was also their opponent in the World Series, the New York Mets, and they made one of the biggest moves at that deadline, Yoenis Cespedes. This guy was a monster for them down the stretch in 2015, and actually, over the 57 games, he had the fourth highest wins above replacement that year with guys like Curtis Granderson, Travis d'Arnaud, Lucas Duda. Cespedes was just going off for them. Hit 287, he slugged 604, had the on base at 337, 17 home runs, 44 RBIs for them. This guy basically carried the Mets all the way to the World Series. In the end, it was all for naught, but the Mets, they were a fun team that year. They made a great run. Cespedes, definitely one of the biggest moves that year. There was also the Blue Jays in 2015. Remember the Jose Bautista bat flip heard around the world in the postseason that year? But the Blue Jays also had a massive trade deadline with David Price being the headliner. He was pitching really well for the Tigers, who had traded for him at the deadline the year prior from the Rays, but the Tigers, they were having a really down year. He was about to become a free agent. He ended up signing with my Red Sox the offseason after, so they decided to move him, and Toronto, they were having a great year. They made the blockbuster move, and he ended up pitching great for them down the stretch. He went 9-1 with an ERA of 2.30 in the postseason. He had his problems, though, but still, this was a massive move. It wasn't just him, though. Remember, they also got Troy Tulowitzki from the Rockies. They sent Jose Reyes, who they had for a little bit there in Toronto. They sent him to Colorado, and Troy Tulowitzki, well, his best years were behind him at that point. He was an all-star in 2015. He was hitting really well for the Rockies that year. Had a 300 batting average for them with an 818 OPS, but then he went to Toronto. His numbers went down, so people were saying, oh, he was only good because it was Coors, whatever. But this was still a blockbuster addition there. They also added Ben Revere. He actually hit pretty well for them down the stretch. Over the 56 games, he hit 319 with an OPS of 734. But in the end, the Blue Jays, they ended up losing to the eventual champion Kansas City Royals in 6 games. But the Blue Jays, they were a pretty memorable team that year. And then we had a bunch of other moves as well. Remember Jonathan Papelbon? He had signed a massive deal with the Phillies, but they ended up trading him a couple of years later to the Washington Nationals. And then we all remember what happened there. Him and Bryce Harper had the scuffle in the dugout. But Jonathan Papelbon was one of the biggest names in the game at the time, just like Cole Hamels, right? Cole Hamels was a postseason hero for the Phillies in 2008. They traded him to the Rangers that year. He actually pitched really well for them down the stretch. He went 7-1, ERA at a 3.66. Remember the Astros, they were competing that year. They won a wild card spot. They traded for Scott Kazmir that year. He didn't pitch all that great for them, but he was pitching really well with Oakland. They also got Carlos Gomez that year. So, man, the Astros, they were busy. Remember Mike Leake? He ended up getting traded from the Reds to the Giants. That was a pretty decent move at the time. He was pretty good overall around that time. And remember the Dodgers and the Braves and the Marlins made this massive trade with the key piece being Matt Latos. He was pretty solid at that time, but when he went to the Dodgers, he started having a whole bunch of injuries, and he just completely fell off at that time. Remember Alex Wood? He was a guy that was emerging during that time. He went to the Dodgers there too. Actually pitched pretty well for the Dodgers in 2015. He was okay. Yeah, ERA at a 4.35. He went 5-6. He was a guy that was making starts for them. But in the end, this was a very eventful deadline. There were a ton of moves being made, and blockbuster moves that ended up being key moves for the postseason. Next up, I got the 2004 trade deadline. How could I not mention 2004 when my Red Sox made the biggest and riskiest trade in franchise history, trading away Boston icon Nomar Garciaparra. I still remember it to this day. I was a young little lad. I was in my room playing video games. I think I just got done watching a Red Sox game, and then flashing across my screen, the Red Sox have traded Nomar Garciaparra to the Chicago Cubs. I was stunned. All of Boston was stunned. How could you trade away a Boston icon, Nomar Garciaparra? Now, Nomar was having a good year at the plate in 2004. He was hitting .321, had an OPS of .867, but there were a few problems with Nomar that year. He was having some injuries first off, wasn't playing great defense at shortstop, and there was some trouble with a possible contract extension. They couldn't come to terms, so there was some bad blood between him and ownership. So Theo Epstein, in the end, he made a risky move. He shipped away Nomar and got back a couple of pieces. You got Orlando Cabrera to improve the defense at shortstop, and then you also got Doug Minkiewicz to improve the defense at first base. Kevin Millar is basically a walking brick at first base. So in the end, it was a rather weird move at the time, because you're thinking Orlando Cabrera, Doug Minkiewicz for Nomar Garciaparra. What in the world is happening? But we all know what happened there. It paid off big time. The defense improved. The chemistry of the team seemed to get better. They got red hot after that point. I mean, that August, they were insane that year. I mean, my goodness, it felt like the team came together at that point, and we all know what happened. They went on to win a World Series. It wasn't just bringing in Orlando Cabrera and Doug Minkiewicz. They also made a separate deal for Dave Roberts, who we know is the manager of the Dodgers today. We all know what happened with Dave Roberts in the postseason. Made the big steal against the Yankees with Mariano Rivera on the mound. So yeah, the Red Sox, they were definitely the story that year in 2004, but there were also some other moves too. For the next trade, I am cheating a little bit because it happened after the trade deadline, but it happened before the waiver deadline. The Rockies put Larry Walker through waivers. He passed through, and the Cardinals ended up making a trade for him. And what a pickup this ended up being. He helped them get all the way to the World Series that year against the Red Sox, through 44 games down the stretch at .280 with a .953 OPS, 11 home runs. This guy was just looking for a chance to play in the postseason. Didn't really get any taste at all during his time with the Rockies and the Expos, and he took advantage towards the end of his career. Ended up hitting pretty well the next year as well in 2005, but good for Larry Walker that he was able to get that chance to get to a World Series. So that was a pretty big move at the time. Then you also had Esteban Loaiza, right? The Yankees, they were trying to beef up their rotation for the stretch run, and Esteban Loaiza, I know, like, he's basically like a drug lord or whatever it is now. I don't know what the heck that is, but Esteban Loaiza, go back to 2003 with the White Sox. He was an all-star that year. He finished second in Cy Young voting. He was kind of whatever for the White Sox in 2004, but the Yankees were hoping to get him back more to those 2003 numbers. Didn't really happen. Ended up giving up the walk-off hit to David Ortiz in Game 5 in the ALCS, but, at the time, it was a pretty big move. Now, a really big move was Carlos Beltran. He was emerging as one of the best players in baseball with the Kansas City Royals. Ended up getting traded to the Astros, and the Astros went on quite the run there. They turned their season around, and he was massive for Houston down the stretch here through 90 games. This was a bit earlier before the trade deadline. It wasn't a trade deadline the day of deal. This happened back in June of that year, but he hit well for them. He had a .926 OPS, had 23 home runs, 28 stolen bases for them. He had a great season that year, and then that postseason, he ended up hitting a bunch of home runs, and then he got a massive contract with the Mets in the offseason. And speaking of the Mets, they made a couple of deals themselves, and I'm sorry, Mets fans, that I have to bring this up, but they traded away one of the top prospects in baseball, Scott Kazmir. He was the number 8 prospect in Major League Baseball at the time. He was pitching really well in the minor leagues, and they traded him away for Victor Zambrano, who was okay at the time, right? With the Rays in 2004, he had 23 games, 22 starts, ERA at a 4.43. Wasn't really anything crazy. I'm thinking, what the heck are the Mets doing here, trading away Scott Kazmir? He was pitching really well in the minor leagues, and then ended up going to the Rays, and he pitched really well over the next few seasons. He had a couple All-Star appearances there. Still to this day, Mets fans are like, why the heck did we do this trade? But ended up having another trade there as well. Chris Benson, he was the #1 pick back in 1996, ended up going to the Mets there from the Pittsburgh Pirates, and that was a 3-team trade that also involved Jose Bautista. This was one of the times that he ended up getting moved, so pretty interesting how that turned out. We had a few other moves as well. Freddie Garcia went from the Mariners to the White Sox. He ended up being a big piece for them in 2005 en route to their World Series championship. The Dodgers made a couple of moves. They brought in Brad Penny from the Marlins. The Marlins were looking to add to the offense a bit. They had a lot of pitching at the time, so Brad Penny ended up going to the Dodgers and then back to the Marlins. We had Paul LaDuca, but Brad Penny ended up being really solid for the Dodgers over the next few years. Had a couple All-Star appearances there. Paul LaDuca, he ended up being with the Marlins through 2005. He was an All-Star in 2005 before going to the Mets in 2006. And then we also had Steve Finley get traded to the Dodgers. He had a lot of good moments with the Padres and the Diamondbacks, helped the D-backs win a World Series in 2001. So people are thinking, Steve Finley on the Dodgers, what the heck is this? But ended up hitting a walk-off home run to help the Dodgers clinch the division that year. Pretty good moment. But 2004, definitely a memorable one, especially for me and Red Sox fans. Up next, we're going to go back a couple of years to 2022, and the big story at this trade deadline was Juan Soto going from the Nationals to the Padres, one of the biggest blockbusters of all time. But there is a bit to unpack here. Let's start at the beginning. So the Nationals were trying to sign him to a long-term extension. He said no. He wanted to bet on himself. So the Nationals thought, okay, we're out of it. We're not going to be competing for the next couple of years. We need to sell this guy while his value is extremely high. Get back a big package of prospects. So they sent him to the Padres. He ended up playing pretty well there for the next couple of years. We'll get to that next part in just a second. But going back to the Nationals, we had C.J. Abrams, now their everyday shortstop. We got James Wood, who just recently came up, one of their top prospects. This guy, the sky is the limit. He could end up being a really good hitter at some point soon. And Mackenzie Gore, a fixture in their rotation, a fixture near the top of their rotation. So they got 3 really good players. They got a couple of more prospects in there. You got Robert Hassel. Hasn't really worked out too much there. But in the end, this is working out for the Nationals. But for the Padres, he did play well there for the next couple of years. But the Padres, they couldn't get over the hump there. So they decided, okay, we need to cut some payroll. Juan Soto's coming up on free agency. Let's trade him. Let's get back some value while we still can. So that's why we saw the trade of Juan Soto to the Yankees this past offseason. And hey, Juan Soto, he's been great for the Yankees so far. Him and Aaron Judge have been amazing in this lineup. Let's see if they can get themselves together in the second half. They did just bring in Jazz Chisholm, so let's see. I'm sure there'll be another move by the deadline. But Juan Soto's been great for the Yankees. I think they need to do whatever it takes to keep him in pinstripes for the rest of his career. But in this trade, going back to the Padres, it's actually worked out for the Padres pretty well. Michael King was one of the big pieces going back here. He's been great for the Padres so far. They also got a couple other pitchers. You got Randy Vasquez, you got Wandy Peralta, but you also got Drew Thorpe in this deal. Now, he's not with the Padres anymore. He is now with the White Sox because the Padres, they turned around and sent him in a package for Dylan Cease, and he has been amazing for the Padres so far this year. So, there's a lot to, unwrap with the Juan Soto deal from a couple of years ago, but in the end, it will go down as one of the biggest blockbusters of all time. I mean, my goodness, the hype around this, the anticipation behind this, it was through the roof. People just couldn't take their eyes off their phone. It was pretty cool to see. It didn't stop there, though. We had plenty more trades. We had Luis Castillo, who was really good for the Reds a couple of years ago, but he was starting to get closer to free agency. The Reds were out of it, so they thought, okay, let's cash in on his value. Let's send him to the Seattle Mariners, and look what he's doing for the Mariners over the last couple of years in that rotation. One of the best rotations in baseball. He's been very good. But we also had Noelvi Marte, one of the top prospects in the game at the time, go back to the Reds. Yes, had the PED suspension at the beginning of the year, but still only 22 years old. There's a lot of upside with Noelvi Marte. We also had Frankie Montas. He was another big pitcher on the market at the time. Funny enough, he's with the Reds now. But that was one big pitcher on the market besides Luis Castillo. Ended up going to the Yankees in this deal. Didn't really do anything with the Yankees. Had a shoulder injury. And here we are a couple of years later. He's with Cincinnati. Speaking of other pitchers out there, we had a couple of closers. We had Josh Hader go from Milwaukee to the Padres. He ended up being really bad for the Padres down that stretch, but was very good last year in 2023. Ended up signing with the Astros this past offseason. We had Raisel Iglesias go from the Angels to the Braves. He was locked down for the Braves. Had an ERA below 0.4, I think a 0.34 to be exact, but he was amazing. Still doing good things for the Braves bullpen. There was also another trade with my Red Sox. We had Christian Vasquez go to the Astros, and he ended up helping them win a World Series. And going back to the Red Sox, we had Wilyer Abreu. He's been one of their biggest contributors this year. There's also Emmanuel Valdez. He's been doing a couple of things with the Red Sox. But we also had, speaking of the Red Sox, Andrew Benintendi. He went to the Yankees from the Royals. Was actually doing really well with them, but he got hurt at the end of the year. Ended up missing the final month of the season. But in the end, this was a very eventful deadline. We also had a few other moves. We had the Yankees send Jordan Montgomery to the Cardinals in a straight-up swap for Harrison Bader. Every time I see that picture, I think it's Jake Paul, and I'm thinking, when did Jake Paul stop boxing and start playing baseball? My goodness. But Jordan Montgomery, he pitched well for the Cardinals. Didn't get them over the hump, though, so later on, they sent him to the Texas Rangers. They got a couple of prospects out of it. He ended up helping the Rangers win a World Series last year. And then for the Cardinals, they also got a couple of prospects in this deal. You got Tekoa Roby, you got Thomas Segjacci, so they're currently in the top 5 in their system. Had a few other deals on top of this. We had Joey Gallo, who did get moved to the Yankees the year prior. That didn't work out. That was a big bust, so they ended up sending him to the Dodgers. Joey Gallo, that's always a head turner every time you hear his name. But we also had Brandon Marsh going from the Angels to the Phillies in a swap with Logan O'Hoppe. Logan O'Hoppe is now the Angels' everyday catcher, and Brandon Marsh is a fixture in the Phillies outfield. And speaking of the Phillies, we also had David Robertson. He went to the Phillies and, hey, ended up pitching pretty well in the postseason for them. They got this close to a World Series. So, and hey, Brandon Marsh as well. He was with the Phillies then too. So there was a lot that happened at this deadline, but in the end, it's going to be all about Juan Soto. This is what people are going to remember the most. Up next, let's talk about 2008. Now, I know I already talked about my Red Sox in 2004 with Nomar Garciaparra, so excuse my bias, but I can't help that the Red Sox were also involved in another blockbuster trade, but this time with Manny Ramirez, one of the greatest hitters of all time. Had an amazing time with the Red Sox, helped them win 2 World Series in 2004 and 2007, but Manny's time with the Red Sox definitely had its fair share of bumps. Now, go back to 2004, he was involved in the A-Rod trade saga. 2005, his name came up in the offseason, possibly going to the Mets, and then during the season there were talks with the Mets and the Orioles. So there was a couple of times it looked like Manny might have been on the move, but ended up staying, ended up being very productive for the Red Sox during his time. But then 2008 came around, and there were a few issues coming up that year. He had an altercation with Kevin Youkilis. There was an altercation with the traveling secretary where he shoved him over an argument about tickets or something along those lines. Yeah, he was having issues, right? And it seemed like the Red Sox, it just became too much of a problem, and they had to move him. There was no other choice. So they moved him to the Dodgers, and he went off for the Dodgers down the stretch. It was incredible. Mannyville was just going crazy. 53 games for the Dodgers down the stretch. He hit .396 with an OPS of 1.232, had 17 home runs. This was so good that he even got MVP votes in the National League, only playing 53 games. He came in 4th place in MVP voting. That is incredible. My goodness, could you imagine if he did this for an entire season? 2008 was easily one of Manny's best seasons. Now, going back to the Red Sox, they did get a good player in return. They got Jason Bay. He was very productive for the Red Sox. He came over from the Pirates. It was a 3-team trade. For the Red Sox in 2008, had an OPS of .897, but he was even better in 2009. Helped the Red Sox get to the playoffs in both years. Had a .921 OPS in 2009. He had 36 home runs. He was an All-Star, MVP, got MVP votes. You know, Jason Bay was a productive player. Ended up going to the Mets after that, and that ended up being one of the biggest busts of all time. But I'll always remember Jason Bay. He was a fun player with the Red Sox during those couple of years. And for the Pirates in this deal, they did get a few prospects. They got Craig Hansen. He was one of the Red Sox top prospects at the time. People were thinking he was going to be the future closer of the Red Sox. Had good velocity, good stuff. Just never put it together. Never put it together either with the Pirates. They got Brandon Moss. He didn't do much for them. He did more for the Athletics down the road. There was also Andy LaRoche. You know, he was viewed as a pretty solid player at the time, but he ended up not really doing much of anything. But I will always remember the trade of Manny Ramirez to the Dodgers in 2008. This was easily one of the biggest blockbusters of all time. We also had a couple other blockbusters in 2008, one involving CC Sabathia, one of the top pitchers in the game. He had a great run with the Cleveland Indians, but the Indians stunk in 2008. He was coming up on free agency, so they thought, okay, we got to move this guy. They ended up trading him to the Milwaukee Brewers, who were trying to get to the postseason for the first time in a long time, and my goodness, he went on a run for the ages. In 2008 for them down the stretch, he went 11-2 with an ERA of 1.65. He had over 130 innings pitched. He had 7 complete games for them during that time. That is absolutely incredible. He basically put the Brewers on his back, took them to the postseason, but in the end, he ran out of gas. They got knocked out by the Phillies in the first round, but this was an amazing run for CC Sabathia. Easily one of the best second halves, if not the best second half of all time. Ended up signing with the Yankees in the offseason. And as for the Indians in this deal, they got back a few players, but the most notable was Michael Brantley. He ended up being really good for them over 10 seasons. Overall, during his time with the Indians, he hit .295 with an OPS of 781. He made 3 All-Star games during that time before going to the Astros in 2019. We also had another blockbuster deal here, and that involved Mark Teixeira. He actually got traded to the Braves the year prior before that deadline, but then the Braves, they weren't very good that year in 2008. They moved him to the Angels, and he was incredible for the Angels. Helped them get to the postseason then. Over 54 games for them. He hit .358, a .449 on base, a .632 slugging, OPS at a 1.081. Had 13 home runs for him. He was really good that year. I mean, he was good for the Braves the year prior too when he got traded from the Rangers. So Mark Teixeira had a good time there. The Angels wanted him to come back, but in the end, he went to the Yankees. But the Angels did get something out of it. Because he went to the Yankees, the Angels got a compensation pick, and that pick ended up being Mike Trout. He's going to go down as one of the best players to ever play. He has been amazing in his career. I hope Mike Trout gets back soon. I want to see him playing again. We also had a couple of Hall of Famers get traded in 2008. Do you remember Ken Griffey Jr. going to the White Sox that year? If you don't remember, that's okay, because it blows my mind every time I see Griffey in a White Sox uniform. But he was okay for the White Sox that year. 41 games, hit .260, OPS a little over 750. Helped the White Sox get to the postseason. They got knocked out by the Rays that year, who ended up making it to the World Series. But yeah, seeing Griffey with the White Sox, kind of weird. We also had Pudge, Ivan Rodriguez, go from the Tigers to the Yankees. Didn't really do all that much with the Yankees, but kind of cool, you know, to think back. You know, you had a couple of legends here get traded towards the end of their career, but these will definitely go down as two of the most forgotten trades in history, at least in my opinion. 2008, absolutely incredible. A few blockbusters, not a ton of trades, but 3 massive trades. And last but not least, we got to talk about 2021. What a crazy trade deadline this was. There were trades left and right. It was absolute madness. But what I loved about this trade deadline was that there were a few big storylines coming out of it. Let's talk about the first one. Let's talk about the blockbuster of this trade deadline. One of the biggest trades of all time. You had Max Scherzer and Trey Turner going from the Nationals to the Dodgers. This was the beginning of the Nationals stripping things down. Remember, they traded Soto a year later, but this was massive for the Dodgers. They got one of the best pitchers in the game and one of the best shortstops in the game. In the end, it didn't help them get over the hump in the postseason. Scherzer ended up going to the Mets the next offseason. Trey Turner later on ended up going to the Phillies. And back to the Nationals, you got Kyber Ruiz. He is their everyday catcher right now. Hasn't fully been able to put it together in the major leagues. They also got Josiah Josiah Gray, promising pitching prospect at the time, did just get elbow surgery not too long ago, so let's see what his future holds. But this was a big trade. This was also the end of an era for the Chicago Cubs. They traded away three faces of the franchise: Chris Bryant, Javier Baez, and Anthony Rizzo. All three players helped them win a World Series in 2016, their first World Series in 108 years. Chris Bryant was the big one. Going to the San Francisco Giants did help them a little bit down the stretch. Wasn't enough to get them over the hump in the postseason, though. He ended up signing with the Rockies later on, and that's not turning out too great. Javier Baez, he went to the Mets. He was actually really good with the Mets. He ended up moving on to the Tigers in that next offseason, and we all know how that's been going. And Anthony Rizzo, he was also moved to the Yankees. He's been pretty productive for the most part. He's been dealing with some health issues this past year, but that was pretty crazy to see, the Cubs selling off these pieces. There was also Craig Kimbrell. He was one of the best relievers in the game at the time. They shipped him to the White Sox. That White Sox bullpen was looking nasty, but he ended up not doing all that great, right? You had Liam Hendricks as the closer. He went to the setup role and he didn't take to that very well. So in the end, this was a massive deadline for the Chicago Cubs. Earlier I mentioned Joey Gallo. This was a bigger trade at the time because he was so good with the Texas Rangers during this season. Ended up going to the Yankees in 2021. It was a massive trade. Yankee fans were really excited about this. People dreamed about Joey Gallo at Yankee Stadium for a long time, and it was an absolute bust. Joey Gallo did next to nothing with the Yankees. It did not work out there at all, but it has worked out for the Texas Rangers a little bit. You got Ezekiel Duran, helped them win a World Series last year, and Josh Smith also was a part of that team last year, but he's been really productive this year in 2024. The other storyline for this was the team that won the whole freaking thing. Speaking of a World Series, how about the Braves making all the moves they made? Ronald Acuna Jr., he went down with an ACL tear. That was the first one, and we just saw the other one this past year. But Ronald Acuna Jr., he went down. So instead of the Braves going after one player to try and fix their issues, they went after four. They got Jorge Soler. He ended up being great for them down the stretch. Didn't do too much with the Royals before this trade, but he absolutely exploded for the Braves. Ended up getting World Series MVP on this World Series run. You had Adam Duvall doing a lot there. Jock Peterson ended up contributing a lot. He was also a guy that was traded from the Cubs that year. And then you also had Eddie Rosario. He was the NLCS MVP. Eddie Rosario ended up being a great left-handed bat for them down the stretch. He was so good in the postseason. This was a great trade deadline for the Braves. Maybe we see something similar this year. We'll just have to wait and see. Now, once again, I'm going to bring up my Red Sox, but it's a good one, okay? It was Kyle Schwarber. They ended up bringing him in from the Nationals, and he was really productive for them down the stretch. During that time, 41 games, had a 957 OPS. He was big in the postseason for them, making it to the ALCS against the Astros. They fell short, but he was a big pickup for them. We also had a few pitchers on the move. We had Jose Barrios going from the Twins to the Blue Jays. They ended up signing him to an extension shortly after that, but he's been a pretty solid guy for the Blue Jays. He's had his ups and downs, but he, for the most part, has been a good pickup for them. We had a couple of veteran guys. John Lester, one of my favorites of all time, went to the St. Louis Cardinals along with J.A. Happ. These two actually helped the Cardinals down the stretch that year. Remember, they went on that crazy run. They won 17 games in a row. So these two were contributors. Other pitchers, we had Jesus Luzardo. I mean, he was one of the top pitching prospects in the game with the Oakland A's, but he was falling apart. They ended up sending him to the Miami Marlins for Starling Marte, and Starling Marte ended up being pretty productive there. But Jesus Luzardo, he was able to turn around his career with the Marlins, had a great season last year, dealing with some injuries this year. But Jesus Luzardo, one of the better pitchers in the game at the time. The Yankees, they got Clay Holmes during this deadline. He was with the Pittsburgh Pirates. Yes, I know Clay Holmes has had his issues, but for the most part, he's been really good for the Yankees. There was also Nelson Cruz. He went from the Twins to the Rays. This was a pretty decent pickup for them. He did okay for them, but in the end, this was just a crazy deadline. There were so many deals. It felt like every time you picked up your phone, something was happening. But that's my list. I know there's a lot of other trade deadlines. I know there's a lot of other trades. trades. I could talk about this stuff just forever. I could do a video over an hour if I really wanted to, but I wanted to try and keep it as short as possible today. I just went with these. Tell me your favorite trade deadlines down below in the comments. Which ones do you think should have been on this list? Which ones do you think were underrated? Tell me some overrated ones, even if you got that in your mind. Let me know everything you think about prior trade deadlines. But everyone, that's all I got for right now. If you can on the way out, hit that like button for me, subscribe if you're new, and I'll talk to you next time.